Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marc Friend. I'm CEO of Rapid. And today we're going to talk about APIs and the digital revolution. So topics we're going to cover: a little bit about technology, a bit about software, how industry works, industry ecosystems, and APIs. So first question I got to ask is, are there any other software, let's call it fans in the room, like me? So by that I mean, when you call a call center, like your telephone company, your airline, your credit card company, do you think about the software that's running as you're talking to that agent? Like when they say, sure, I know how to do that. Or when they say can't, it really means I might have to ask the supervisor. But when they say won't, it means I have no idea how this software works. That's how I think about things. And the reality is that's how the world works today. We just can't seem to let go of our devices and our software. So let's talk about the digital revolution, how technology plays a part, and how it affects the rules of the game. So the best technology solutions become ubiquitous, and they completely rewrite the rules. And I go back to a great quote about Einstein's relativity, and we'll see how this is relevant later, but it said that matter tells us space how to curve, and space tells matter how to move. And it was talking about the gravitational forces on space and movement, and software is having that same effect on industry and likewise. So let's talk about technology first and how innovators become ubiquitous. So my favorite example is 1880, Thomas Edison receives a patent for what? The electric light. And for decades, we called it the electric light. Why? Because we needed to differentiate it between gas lighting. However, you move forward today, we don't talk about electric lighting. We just say lighting. It's ubiquitous. It's won the game. When we talk about phones, my 14 and 16-year-olds don't know what a cell phone is. They just know their phone is a phone. And whoever imagined that shopping would look like this and this and this? Never. So how does that Einstein quote come into play? Well, industry dictates how software is built, and software dictates how industries work. Let's take a look at that. So one example is, how does technology change our entire ideas of consumption as consumers? And when is it going to come after your industry? One of my favorite examples, we're going to use it a couple times here, is Uber. And it's not just an app, but it's changed the way we think about and the way we consume automobiles. In the United States, a survey done by the University of California, Davis, found that 27% of the population were putting off automobile purchases because they could use ride sharing. So not only did they create a category, not only did they win that category, but Uber has changed the way that we think about consuming automobiles. A software company changing the way we consume automobiles. Think about that. So as we move forward, let's think about APIs, application programming interfaces. What is an API? Well, it's software, but it's not just another piece of software. It's a software that tells you how to connect to it, how to communicate with it. It describes the ecosystem it sits in. It describes the relationships with the consumers and developers of the API, right? So we like to draw out these great diagrams and architectures of how APIs are connected and how we call APIs. And it really confuses the process of, or the question of what is an API? Is it a connector or is it an abstraction? And I would argue that it's actually an abstraction. And APIs help us create abstraction layers. So for those of you who study software, this is old hat. But what we talk about is the ability to encapsulate an entire unit of work and encapsulate that and then abstract it with a single interface. So abstraction, encapsulation. So what are some examples in software? Well, one of the great ones was Windows. Windows came out when the PC came out. What did it abstract? It abstracted away all the hardware below the software operating system. I could run any Windows program on any PC, IBM, Dell, otherwise, with any Intel chip. It didn't matter. It created that abstraction. Likewise, the web came along and we needed DNS. I wanted to be able to type, mycompany.com. but it has to get resolved to an IP address. So DNS was the abstraction layer, largely built by VeriSign to create that, to allow that to happen. Likewise, I need maps, I need directions. I go to Google. My software needs to accept payments, etc. So all of these things have abstracted away technology below it. Windows abstracted away the PC. Oracle abstracted away the physical database. Adobe Acrobat abstracts away the various forms of writing software, Word, etc. So, these are some pretty useful APIs or abstraction layers. How many Windows users are there worldwide? About 1.5 billion. How many Acrobat downloads? 1 billion, 16 billion documents. How do I know this? I downloaded the PDF on the Adobe website. So those are pretty big numbers and pretty good numbers, but let's look at some other forms of APIs. And the question is, how do you think about APIs? Again, it's how do you interface with the service that you're using and what service is encapsulated? Well, if you go back to probably before most of you were born, this was the API for my bank. I had to go to a teller and wait in line, talk to someone physically just to make a deposit, just to make a withdrawal, any transactions. Well, they finally got smart and created this new abstraction layer called ATMs. And ATMs changed the way we banked. That was pretty good. They also created a nice abstraction layer called credit cards. How is a credit card an abstraction layer? Well, it represents a token for me to be able to transact worldwide in almost any currency, in almost any vendor across the globe. That's a pretty good abstraction. And if you think about it, even money itself, currency, is an abstraction for trade. So abstraction layers and abstractions have been going on in industry forever. And yet all of these abstraction layers in money, we now have on our phone. So that's how technology is beginning to change the way we use and work with abstraction layers, and financial services is just one example. Let's move on to industries, because we're going to see that there are abstraction layers in industries as well, and how those abstraction layers are built. And to use an example, I'm going to use the US film industry from the beginnings in the early 1900s to today, to streaming media, to talk about ecosystems and abstraction layers in the real world. So for those of you who don't know, if you go to almost any small town or even medium-sized town in the US today, you will still see a Paramount Theater or a Fox Theater or United Artists Theater. And the question is why? Well, the answer is that when film came into play in 1910 or so, silent movies, there were film studios, and the film studios owned the actors, and they owned the directors, and they produced the films and distributed them. And those were the winning companies: Paramount, Fox, Universal, etc. Then a little bit later came a really radical production company, United Artists. So United Artists are actually a group of four: Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith. So three of the most famous actors of the time, and this was circa 1919, one of the greatest directors at the time. And they thought that, hey, actors were not getting the fair shake, that the film companies owned all the distribution, they were taking all of the profits. So what did they do? They created their own production company called United Artists, and the first industry stack was created. So you had production company, distribution company, completely different companies. And the actors were able to get more of the profits of the industry. Didn't hold out long though. In about 1933, there was enough turmoil that the Screen Actors Guild was created, a union of actors, to make sure that they got their fair share of the profits away from the production companies. So now you had distribution that was separate, you had production companies, and you had actors. 3 layers to this distribution or economy, the supply chain, value chain. Weren't done there. In the 40s, some lawsuits were filed, and an antitrust in the U.S., an antitrust decree was found or presented by upheld by the Supreme Court, that the 8 major film companies, distribution companies, had conspired to control the industry. And they required the separation of film distribution and exhibition so that anyone who owned movie theaters had to divest of their distribution operations or vice versa. So by rule of law, there was now 4 layers in the industry, in the film industry. So you had actors and, of course, directors, everything to do with production. You had the actual marketing and distribution, and you had the owners of retail screens, right? So how much more complex could it get? Well, let's look at today. Today, we have a myriad of different layers. Most of them are independent. Most entrants have come in through one of the many layers. And as we'll see, they've all expanded. So you think about, for those of you who don't know who DreamWorks is, that's Steven Spielberg's company. What is he known as? As a director. But as a director, he also decided, hey, I should be producing my own films, executive producing my own films, meaning I should finance them so that I get a bigger part of the profit. Then you look at something like Playtone, that's Tom Hanks' company, where he's both a director and an actor and a producer sometimes. And you look at when cable TV came in. Now remember, we used to have this huge distinction between what's TV and what's film. Now it's getting kind of fuzzy. HBO was one of the early cable companies. They were an aggregator or a distributor of films. They then became a producer of films. They were known as one of the cutting edge film producers. So they've took a place inside the stack and expanded. And you've got companies like Comcast, which owns Xfinity in the US and Sky Broadcasting in the UK. They do production, post-production, they do marketing, they do physical distribution, right? They actually run cables to the homes in the US. And then you got Netflix. I'm not even sure how to define them, right? They were an aggregator, they were an information provider and a distributor and a marketer, and they also got in production. So now you get Netflix productions. And Apple is played up and down the stack almost all the way. And so we see that we have new entrants coming into different layers in technology, different layers in the stack of an ecosystem, and expanding from there. And it wasn't even done at Apple, because then, you got the entry of Amazon. And of course, Amazon has taken everything from production all the way through to distribution. And this is the way that economies have evolved over time. And what we find out is that, the companies that become ecosystems, the Apples, the Amazons, Microsoft with, their stack of software, Tesla with their networks of chargers, their cars, their batteries, the top 10 market cap companies over time have become almost all ecosystem companies, and they've grown in size tremendously. In 2001, the top 10 companies were valued at $2.7 trillion. 10 years later, it was $2.5 trillion. You still had only 2 ecosystem companies, Microsoft and Apple, in 2011. But by 2021, that number had grown by about 4x to $13 trillion. And all but 2 are ecosystem companies. Ecosystems are absolutely critical to economics and to business today. So these ecosystems, they redefine business, and the software of those ecosystems redefine business. How does that work? We talked about Uber. We talked about how not only are they changing ride sharing, but they're also changing car ownership. They're having an impact on the number of parking lots in urban development. Urban real estate's changing. Climate change? Maybe less cars on the road. Well, how did they become so ubiquitous, so successful, so fast? And the answer is that they built with a stack. APIs are the new stack. If you think about it, Uber has 2 apps, a driver app and a rider app. And after that, everything is an API. They still have to authenticate me. they need maps and navigation for their drivers. I need to be able to communicate with my driver via SMS or voice. I need to be able to use a credit card, and they need to be able to pay the drivers. All of that is done with a stack of APIs. So rider app, driver app, stack of APIs. APIs are the new stack. And when you're talking about mobile phones, these apps are everywhere and they're always on, right? So that's what's taking over the industry. So that's how software's been built from software companies. Let's talk about other industries, non-software, non-technology industries. Well, what we find is that enterprises are building API-based ecosystems the same way. They're connecting to their distribution chains, their supply chains, their partners through APIs. Just the way that the Uber stack worked, we see it in every industry. So for those of you who flew here, you had an electronic boarding pass. That boarding pass probably took about 15 API calls to be created. Different authentication, security, planes, airport operations, upgrade systems. Don't believe me? Let's look at the data. There is a different layer of services for every piece of your ticket, including flight status, gate information, airport operations, the loyalty programs, your upgrade programs, your in the US TSA pre-check, so security. It's the way that businesses are beginning to build their software and the way they're beginning to build their businesses. So we talk to businesses of all types, and we hear this all the time, that we as a business are trying to increase our revenues by increasing our ranges of services, by increasing our distribution. And we know that to do that, we have to build out our API management and create APIs that can be consumed by partners. That's how we compete. This is a quote from Liberty Mutual, a US-based insurance company, but we hear it and see it everywhere. Most recently, I was at Mobile World Congress, the biggest cellular telco industry trade show in the world, one of the largest trade shows in the world, period. Front page, first day, Mobile World Congress news, global players grasp API opportunity. So happening in the API world. And here's another example. Nokia, an equipment switch business, right? They provide switches and cell towers and cellular communications technology to all of the carriers, the CSPs as they call them, carrier service providers. And they're building stacks of services and software all the way up to surveillance and security with drones and unmanned aerial vehicles. So a switch company selling services. How does that work? Well, the demo that they were showing at Mobile World Congress was based on how do we help the Port of Antwerp manage navigation. So here's how we think of ports. We think of huge ships run by captains going down the channel, maneuvering with hundreds of millions of dollars of valuable cargo. There's only one problem with that, and that's that there's actually a shortage of captains. It's very hard to find enough captains to captain all these ships. So what do? You use technology. So the way ships are captained today looks like this. The guy on the right is running multiple screens, and he is operating barges or ships in the channel, making sure that the cargo is safe, that ships don't collide, that every timing is correct. So how does that happen? Well, they have a stack of software and services, starting with the core network. How does that work? So at the top of the stack, they have CFAR, which is a services company that provides these captains of ships. So these captains are outsourced, the way we outsource everything today, to a services company that is interconnected with the telco, the local carrier, which is Telenet, a subsidiary of Liberty Global, which then is running on software created by IMEC, a regional software provider, on the Nokia Network as Cloud platform, which happens to be based on the Rapid software, and on Nokia equipment. So the Nokia equipment can provide high quality of service on demand to the ships to ensure that there are no blind spots, to ensure that there's no loss of connectivity, so that the service providers using their software can control the ships in the channel. That is the way the new world looks in a stack of software. So again, industry dictates how software is built, and software dictates how industry works. And APIs are the connective tissue that brings that all together. So I thank you for your time. I want to impart upon you how important everything that we are all doing here in the world of APIs is important. We're redefining the pace of innovation, and that's the way we look at the world from the Rapid point of view. So thank you for your time, and have a great afternoon.